Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. The UN is back in the hot seat. A leaked UN report is exposing how the world body knew about unsanitary conditions at bases in Haiti, a month after a cholera epidemic erupted in the country. It's widely acknowledged that the UN peacekeepers from Nepal brought cholera to Haiti. DNA tests proved that the cholera strain in Haiti was a perfect match to the strain active in South Asia. The UN has consistently denied being responsible for the outbreak, but now with this leaked report, it could provide more evidence for the 1,500 Haitian cholera victims and families who are suing the UN for negligently bringing cholera to Haiti months after an earthquake devastated the country. Now joining us is one of the attorneys for the victims, Brian Concannon. He's the executive director of the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. Thanks so much for joining us, Brian.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Jessica. It's good to be with you.
So, Brian, let's start out by discussing some of the alarming findings in the report. A month after the cholera outbreak began, more than 1 in 10 UN camps were still disposing of sewage directly into local environments. So essentially, we're talking about dumping into rivers. Do these accounts corroborate some of your own findings?
It corroborates, but it's much worse than we thought. We knew that the UN base in May, where the cholera broke out, that was dumping their waste into the river. We didn't know that it was system-wide, that 10% of all camps were doing this. And it's also important to note that 10% of the camps were dumping their toilet water. 70% of them were dumping what's called gray water, which is a mixture of shower water and kitchen water that can also contain infectious diseases.
So despite all this evidence, we have more than 9,000 people who were killed, more than 800,000 Haitians infected. And the UN is basically saying that they're immune. They're claiming immunity from any claims of compensation. How are they able to claim immunity, and why do you think the UN has forfeited that claim?
Well, first of all, the 9,000 people killed is an extremely conservative estimate. That's the official number. Everybody acknowledges that the real number is much higher. A study that came out last month said it's probably 4 to 10 times higher. So we're really talking of in excess of 40,000 people killed. This is the worst single country cholera epidemic in modern times by far. The UN no longer seriously denies that it caused the cholera epidemic, although it has not formally acknowledged that. The UN also does not seriously contest that it has an obligation to the victims. Even the UN's own human rights experts have been very publicly insisting that the UN has an obligation to respond better to the victims and to give them their day in court. What the UN is saying is that it, without denying that it caused the problem or that it is responsible, it's saying that no one can make it take that responsibility. So in our case, we filed a case in U.S. courts on behalf of cholera victims, and the UN is saying that no U.S. court, or any other court for that matter, can hear a case against the UN. And what they rely on, it's a treaty, it's called the Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the United Nations, and they point to Article 2 of that treaty, which does say that the UN is immune from suits in national courts. And we understand that, and that's actually a good thing. It gives the UN protection from harassment by some national courts. But in exchange for that immunity, which is an extraordinary grant of power to say that people are immune from courts pursuing them, in exchange for that, the UN agreed to provide an alternate mechanism in the same treaty. So it's Section 29 of the same treaty. The UN says that it will provide alternate mechanisms for people who are claiming injuries by UN operations. Now, what the UN is saying before U.S. courts is that the U.S. courts should look at Article 2 or Section 2, but should ignore Section 29. That once you get to Article 2, you stop reading and you say the UN is immune, and that you don't take into account the fact that the UN has agreed to providing an alternate mechanism for justice for people hurt by its operations.
Is there precedent for the UN invoking immunity?
The UN invokes immunity all the time. It just hasn't made this kind of an extensive grab for immunity. In the past, the UN has had immunity for things like peacekeeper operations. So there was a famous case in the Yugoslav wars, where the UN pulled out of a safe haven and thousands of people were killed. And courts in Europe upheld the immunity, saying that the courts should not be second-guessing battlefield decisions. In another case in U.S. courts, someone who was sexually harassed by her boss at the UN, she filed a complaint with the UN. The UN agreed to give her the alternative justice as it's obligated to do, and the victim of the harassment didn't feel that the UN process was fair, so challenged it. And in that case, the U.S. courts did say, well, we're not going to second guess the UN's justice proceedings, so we are going to uphold its immunity. But the UN has never come before a court in the U.S. or anywhere else, as far as we know, and say, yes, we refuse to comply with our side of the bargain, but we want the court to uphold our protection that we got in exchange for the bargain.
So, Brian, I know that you and your organization are in the middle of challenging the UN's reasoning. You recently presented an appeal before a federal appeals panel in New York. Can you just give us some background as to why the case was dismissed in lower courts in the first place, and just a quick update on the status of the appeal?
Sure. The UN never appeared in the case, but at the district court level, the U.S. government, through the Department of Justice, appeared and made the argument that the UN's immunity is absolute under Section 2, and also told the judge that, look, Judge, you need to defer to the executive branch on foreign affairs, and it's our determination that the UN can't be sued in this court. And the judge agreed, and the judge did dismiss it, which was not surprising. We always felt this was an issue that needed to go to an appeals court. And we got our day in court on March 2nd, and we were very pleased with it. The judges asked the U.S. government some very tough questions. They asked the U.S. government what it had been doing to apply pressure on the UN to fulfill its obligations. The lawyer for the government was not able to say that it had done anything. The judges asked a lot of very hard questions about leaving victims of recklessness who lost a lot, leaving them with no access to justice whatsoever, and the judges were deeply concerned by that. So we're not able to make a prediction as to how the court's going to decide, but we were certainly encouraged by the questions, and it's clear that the judges were deeply troubled by this large assertion of immunity by the United Nations.
So the Department of Justice is essentially representing the UN in this case. Brian, I want to ask you, could the United States be doing more to pressure the UN to take more accountability?
Well, the judges asked the U.S. Attorney if it could, and the U.S. Attorney said, yes, there's lots of things that can be done. And then the judges asked, have they been done? And they hadn't. So there's many things that the U.S. could do. Obviously, the U.S. is the largest contributor to the UN. That gives it an awful lot of influence. And when the U.S. does want the UN to do something, that usually happens. It's clear in this case that the U.S. is not only failing to take leadership, and I think there's a great opportunity for leadership on this issue, but the U.S. is actually taking the side that the UN should not respond fairly to the cholera victims. There's other countries that have been stepping up and have been pushing the UN. The UN's own human rights experts are stepping up. But so far, the United States government has not, to our knowledge, done anything to encourage the UN to respond fairly to the cholera victims. And
you were saying that they've actually done the opposite. You're hearing?
Yes, we've heard lots of reports where the U.S. government has downplayed the legal claims, the legal responsibilities of the UN, and has even discouraged other countries from pursuing this with the United Nations.
All right, Brian Concannon, we'll have to certainly have you back on once that appeal decision comes out. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for covering this case.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.